Good morning, welcome to church this morning, Mackay Church of Christ. So please, you can be with us. And if you're new or visiting, we offer you a very special and warm welcome today. Well, it's good that you're here today. We started a new series, Matthew, the Memoirs of a Publican, or we might refer to him as the Memoirs of a Tax Collector. And it's a lot to get through over the next couple of weeks, so it's going to take some effort on all of our behalf. I would love you to be able to grab a notebook and to follow through as we go through. And your homework for 2 weeks' time is to read the first 3 chapters of Matthew, chapters 1 to 3. Next week is Mother's Day, so we'll be taking a break for a very special Mother's Day service. So you've got 2 weeks to read Matthews 1 to 3. And what I'd love you to do is, I'll give you some examples here of what I would love you to do, is to write down the headings of each chapter and verses as we go through. So I've got an example here for you that I did earlier, Matthew 1 to 17, the genealogy of Jesus. Or example 2, Matthew 1, 16 to 25, the birth of Jesus Christ. So in your notebook, write that down. And then, as you have your kapow moments, as the scriptures stand out, as the Holy Spirit guides you in your reading, and you have a moment and you go, that just changes everything. Write that down next to it within that structure. So at the end of this, you'll have something to go back on, and obviously then you can take notes as we go through this as well. There's an example of what I mean. So we're going to look at today, we're going to start in modules. We're going to go through 4 modules today. Module 1, Module 2, Module 3, Module 4. And Module 1 is the scope of the land. Scope of the land, what's happening in the land leading up to Jesus arriving on the scene. Because the account of Matthew is one of the Gospels that he tells us all about this man Jesus and his life. However, it's really important that we know and understand a little bit about the powder keg, the simmering tensions, the backdrop of the culture, what our Jesus finds when he arrives on the scene. What was Jesus walking into? What was he trying to achieve? Why would Matthew have written it this way? Why did Matthew structure it like that? Why has Matthew recorded it this certain way? And there's 4 parts to the background of when Jesus arrives on the scene. And first of all, we'll look at the historical background in Module 1. And perhaps you might remember some of this from our time in Daniel. I can remember Leanne and I and a friend of mine went down to Canberra, through Canberra to up into the Snow Mountains to go snowboarding, up to Perisher. And we stopped in at Canberra on the way through to visit my grandma, and we had breakfast with her, and she made us food to take up on the slopes with us. And why grandma doesn't waste anything, and she had quite a bit of stuff in her house that was out of date, and she didn't want to waste it, so she used that. Well, we were hungry on the way up to the mountain, so we ate the food on the way, and we all suffered from bad diarrhea for the rest of the day. And it was really off-putting, as you can imagine, in all your ski gear, having to race off the slopes to find the toilet, to find A, a toilet, B, to get off your gear and get sat down while you still had time. It was quite comical, but my grandma, wastes nothing. Well, God's a little bit the same. He wastes nothing. As we look at the historical context for 300, 400, 500 years prior to Jesus arriving, we'll see that God wastes nothing. So we look at some of the historical context that helps us to understand the world that Jesus arrives into. The cultures, the thought patterns, the theology, the thinking, the perceptions, the false teachings. And our story today starts in around 586 BC, where Daniel and the Jews are exiled to Babylon. Persia takes over in 539 BC, and those captives are led under 2 captors for a while. And it's here in the captivity that the house worship starts, because they couldn't get to the temple, so the synagogue worship started, where you could go and worship in a house with friends without having to go to the temple. Well, in around 520 BC, the Jews start to return. They start to trickle back from exile, and they rebuild the temple. And this slowly happens over a period of time, and we get to then the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, in around about 420 BC. And after Malachi, we have what is commonly known as the intertestamentary period for around 400 years. And in this time, there's no prophets, no direct word from God, no inspired books written. However, there's lots of material that was written from, let's say, external sources. And this heavily influenced the Jews' thinking prior to Jesus. And lots of these historical books in this intertestamental period influenced the way people were thinking when Jesus arrived. Josephus was a Pharisee. He was an historian. He recorded history. He just recorded information. He's how we know that James was killed by being thrown off a wall and then stoned. There was books like Maccabee, 1st and 2nd Maccabee, which was the history of the Maccabees' uprising and revolt. There was commentaries, the Talmud, for instance, which was a commentary about the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, but it was written by the rabbis. There was Apocrypha writings going around. These were the books that were between the Old and the New Testament in that 400 period. Books like the History of Susanna, the Wisdom of Solomon, Esther, additions to Esther. There was pseudographae writings, false writings, where you might do some writings and you would use a name from the Old Testament, someone popular, and you'd use that to give weight to your writings. So we had books like, for instance, the Revelation of Moses, not written by Moses, written by someone else who just used their name. And these writings over this 400-year period, well, they influenced the people. And lots of Jesus' teachings that we'll read about was used to correct the actions and thoughts from these type of writings. I'll give you an example of what I mean. The Talmud. So the Talmud had quite a lot of commentary on the Sabbath. It wasn't biblical. It wasn't from the scriptures. It was written by the rabbis who made all these rules on the Sabbath. So people who were trying to obey the Sabbath rule were obeying the Talmud, not the scriptures. There was lots of writings on end times. And so people's perception of what the Messiah would be were corrupted by these writings on end times. So if you can just stick with me, we've come through the Babylonian Empire to around 330 odd BC, and the Greek Empire started, and the Greek Empire rules from around 333 to 167 BC. And you may remember Alexander the Great from this period. And in this time, Palestine was, for 200 years, which is the whole history of Australia, under the control of the Greek Empire. And Israel was fought over several times, and it was particularly a place of area of squabble between regional powers. What I mean by this is Egypt ruled Palestine for 320 to 198 BC down in the south, and then up in the north, Syria ruled it from 198 to 167 BC. So you can imagine you've got fighting coming from the north, fighting from the south, they're fighting all the time, and they want to control this piece of land in the middle as a buffer, not to affect their lands in the fighting. And Israel becomes this middle piece of ground. And one of those kings, one of the regional powers, his name was Antiochus Epiphanes, and he closed the temple, he sacrificed a pig on the temple, and he banned circumcision. He was trying to destroy the people and their religion. And from this time, Greek dominated. This 200 years, the Greek Empire dominated. Not just from a military standpoint, but from a sociology point of view, from arts, culture, language. They dominated everything. And this had an effect on the Jews. You see, they started to forget how to read. They started to forget how to speak Hebrew. And the Hebrew language started to fade as the Greek cultures dominated. And I can understand this. Leanne's family, my wife, is from a Dutch background, and her grandparents spoke beautiful Dutch. Her parents still spoke it but struggled, and Leanne, the 3rd generation, doesn't speak Dutch at all. So these Jews' whole life revolved around religion, scriptures, and so they needed to create a Greek version of the Old Testament. And that's how we got the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament. And 70 scholars were brought together to translate the Old Testament into Greek. And then towards the end of the Greek Empire, if you remember that Antiochus, this didn't go down particularly well. And the Maccabees revolted. And they gained independence for that area around 167 to 63 BC. And they revolted against Syria and it won. And so they had their independence again. But in that time, there's this big vacuum for the leadership. And have you ever wondered how the Pharisees started? Well, the Pharisees, who were scribes, who during this time of the Maccabees revolt, they wanted to fight against the Greek influence. We need to get back to our Hebrew scriptures. We need to get back to our scriptures. But even though they were Jesus' greatest enemies in Jesus' time, when they started up, they were actually the original heroes. We had the Sadducees. Well, the Sadducees, they were the current priests, and they took over the vacuum of this leadership that was left. And so the priests that were charged with the teaching abandoned their role to take over the leadership. And the Pharisees became the teachers, and the teachers became the Sadducees. So everyone moved up one rung on the ladder. There was Essenes. Essenes were, I guess, like monks. They lived in the desert. They saw the city as corrupt. They kept to the Old Testament, Hebrew Old Testament. They wrote it down. They were very careful to preserve the Old Testament in its Hebrew format. And they hid their scriptures in the caves to preserve the old scriptures. And in 1947, a young shepherd boy finds them, and they became the Dead Sea Scrolls. Amongst all this, there was Zealots. There was Herodians. Herodians were a political party or a people that were sympathetic to Herod, the king, and actually, in fact, thought that he might actually be the Messiah. He did rebuild the temple. He was a king. Now, we can start to understand that. And then around, as you know, we've been coming down, around 63 BC into the New Testament period, the Romans came along. And Rome absolutely destroyed Syria and anything, and they dominated Palestine. And what the Romans would do was they'd sell off their rights to collect taxes. I get like an early franchise, if you will. And one of these, and these were called publicans. These people who bought these tax runs were called publicans. And Matthew was where we find him. Matthew was one of these publicans. Just quickly, as we finish on the scope of the land, it's important to understand that between 14 BC and 93 AD is a period of time that we call the Pax Romana, where there was no wars, 100 years of no war. We can't go 10 years without a war, but there was no wars. And in that time, the Roman Empire built this beautiful road system so they could move their troops from place to place easily. Greek was still the universal language. It was the universal language in its words, in its literature, in its culture. The Romans still used Latin for the law, but Greece was the dominant language. So you can imagine for the disciples and for Jesus, it was easy and safe to travel on good roads to transverse this period with a universal language. So it gives us a bit of a historical background that leads up until the point when Jesus arrives. We then got the people. The people. Well, poverty was a fairly major issue. Religion was a central part of the life for most Jews. There was a high literacy rate amongst the Jews because they had to learn to read to be able to know the law. There was a class division there, different to what we would see as our class division now. The class division was made up of aristocracy, which was the Sadducees that had moved up from the Pharisees, and the Pharisees had moved up. And the Sadducees only believed in the Old Testament. There was the Pharisees as well. There was the common people. There was publicans, the tax collectors. There were sinners, and there were slaves. It was estimated that 40% of the Roman Empire was in slavery. Social problems. Slavery was a problem. High divorce rates, prostitution, infanticide amongst particularly the Gentiles, where boys were preferential, and so little girls were left out to die. And one of the marks of that early Christianity movement was the rescuing of orphans. Child abuse was rampant, more in the lines of where orphans are raised as thieves and prostitutes. The religious life, well, temple worship for the Jews was a central part of their life. They had feasts to match in with this. The synagogue in the community was the lifeblood of that community. Emperor worship probably was most of the world practiced some form of emperor worship at that time. So Jesus arrives into a time that the Roman Empire is ruling, and at its strength, it's at its best. Palestine is under the rule of the Romans, and the Romans at this stage are at their peak, as I said. Palestine is politically ruled by a Roman appointee, and that's King Herod. All these names will be ringing a bell. The rule is maintained by a Roman army, which is appointed by Pilate. and the day-to-day affairs are run by the wealthy Sadducee ex-priests, and the Pharisees become the teachers of the law. So there's this hotbed of turmoil. People were thinking that it's coming to an end, that the world as we know it is coming to an end, that this Messiah would come and he would restore the Jewish people and the culture back to the top of the food chain like they had been in the past when David was king. And great expectancy. It was this big powder keg of expectations, people. There was resentment from centuries of occupation, false teachings, misread scriptures. And it's all waiting to erupt, and Jesus enters the scene. And all this is important to understand because as we read Matthew's account of Jesus alludes to a lot of this history. And being able to understand it certainly unlocks a lot of his teachings, and more importantly, unlocks a lot of Jesus' teachings. So we come to Module 2. Module 2, the canon. How did Matthew end up in the Bible? So into this fracas that we're talking about comes Jesus. And Jesus is born in a stable in Bethlehem, and he moves to Egypt for a little while, goes down south to Egypt. He's raised in the Nazarene by a carpenter and his wife. He attends the synagogue on a regular basis. He attends temple worship once a year, and he takes on his father's trade, and he becomes a carpenter. And after this, he makes his move into public ministry at the age of around 30. And straight away, Jesus confronts these Sadducees. Jesus confronts the Pharisees. Jesus confronts the Roman government. Jesus confronts Herod the king. And he proceeds to tell them all that in actual fact, this Messiah that everyone's talking about, this Messiah that everyone is expecting, is no other than himself. And given all the circumstances we've been talking about this morning, you can understand why they were skeptical. He is nothing like what they expected. And when you start to understand what they were expecting, you can understand the skepticism. But you see, they all had a problem. They could not explain the miracles. So in this environment that we've talked about this morning, Jesus is hailed as a king, is murdered as a criminal, and then resurrected to demonstrate his deity. So our Matthew, our tax collector, our publican, writes and records about Jesus and the life and the events that take place. And we now refer to this as the Gospel of Matthew. And as we talk about Matthew himself and the book itself, let's just continue to quickly look at how this ends up in the New Testament. Well, what we need to understand is that the Bible in the format that we use today was not how it was back in this time. There were scriptures. However, they were the Jewish writings. And we would now refer to them as the Old Testament. And these were the writings that the apostles used to argue the deity of Jesus. For example, in Joel, it's prophesied that the Spirit will come on everyone. And then Peter in Acts talks about what Joel had prophesied had come true, that it had happened. Another example might be Timothy 2:3-3:15. It says, how from infancy you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. So the apostles used the Old Testaments. They used the stories of its prophets to refer to show that this Jesus was in actual fact the Messiah. The Old Testament was the only thing they had to refer to as scriptures to evangelize. So the spread of the gospel, the preaching, the miracles performed by the apostles, their writings, their experiences became highly sought after commodities. That they came to be as authoritative as those Old Testament scriptures, especially amongst those early churches of the Gentiles. So as these apostles travelled on these nice roads and ministered, that their writings became known as inspired writings of God. And the apostles were aware of the importance of these writings. The apostles understood that they were speaking the words of the Christ, and what they were to teach would become authoritative to the church. So the question is, did Matthew understand what they were saying was inspired? Yeah, he did. But as time marches on, as it does, it became clear to the early church that they needed to be able to identify and collect the inspired writings. And why did they need to collect them? Well, three things. One, the writers, the apostles, our friend Matthew, they started to die. They started to perish. So there had to be the ability to confirm that the authorship was theirs. And this was fading as they were dying. They couldn't say, yes, that is my writings. Two, false teaching started to creep into the church. And that church wanted and it needed a complete set of scriptures. Three, Rome wanted to destroy the church. So the easy way to destroy the church was to destroy its writings, to destroy its records. And it became illegal to store the book or to store a book of Matthew or the writings of Matthew. So you need to know that it was the right one, because you wouldn't want to die or be persecuted for a fake. All this is building to a time in around 320 AD when a Roman emperor had a vision. And from this vision he won a huge battle and he gave all the credit to Jesus. A long story short is this Emperor Constantine took on Christianity as the Roman religion. And Constantine charged a man by the name of Eusebius to prepare and print 50 of what we would now call the Bible. So some helps from his friends and the church, as it was back then. They, long story short, came up with 27 books, now known as the New Testament. And this task and the printing of these 50 books was finalised about 380 AD. And this does sound like a long time. But you've got to understand, in that time, things took decades, not days. And the cost, the money cost, it was something only an emperor could afford. Can you just begin to imagine, with no printing press, no computers, no email, to allocate the books and to print 50 copies? It's truly an inspiring story on its own. So from this we have the New Testament Canon. We have the New Testament Canon. And the word canon was derived from the word cane or cane, a rod, a measuring rod. So it represents the books that measure up, that met the criteria to be in the canon. And considerations for the canon were that it had to be written by or under the direction of an apostle, well circulated within the church during their lifetime, and accepted by the church in the apostolic age. And everything we've been through this morning, I'm sure you would all agree that Matthew met this criteria, which the early church leaders agreed. So they came up with a New Testament. So at the end of 380, roughly AD, we've got the New Testament and 50 copies of it, including our book of choice, Matthew. And this has remained the same for the last 1600 years. So we come into module 3, the Publican, Matthew. Well, Matthew is one of Jesus' chosen disciples who, when Jesus found him, was a publican, or we might more commonly know that as a tax collector. And being a tax collector was a hugely profitable business. Not a particularly popular one, but there was plenty of coin being a tax collector. And Matthew leaves all this behind to follow Jesus. Now, Matthew's probably not the man you and I would choose to lead a movement that would change the world. I can imagine if human resources placed an advertisement for a religious leader to change the world, I'm not sure Matthew would have got past the first round of interviews. I think that you'd probably want a priest, or you want a scholar, not some dirty tax collector. Mind you, as I read through this, something that stood out for me is that I'm not sure I would have picked me for what I do either. If I was Jesus, I don't think I would have picked me. But Jesus qualifies the unqualified to do his work. And if I can just park this sermon for one moment and say this to you this morning, never, ever be afraid of what God asks you to do. Because I am an exhibit A of God qualifies us to do what we are not qualified to do. Never be afraid of what God wants you to do. He will qualify you to do it. So, this man, Matthew, Well, some tidbits for this. Matthew. Well, his original works were called According to Matthew. And this book, According to Matthew, was universally accepted by the early church as apostolic writings as early as about 125 AD. So coming towards the end of the first century into the second century, it was universally accepted by the church that this was the book of Matthew. Pappus, who was an early historian, he writes in his book that he believes the original copy written in Hebrew was written in around 65 AD. Scholars believe that it was written between 65 and 70 AD. And the reason they say this is because there's no mention in the Bible of the temple that was destroyed in 70 AD. Matthew refers or talks about Jesus saying that it will happen or prophesying that the temple will be destroyed, but there's no actual words in there about the temple being destroyed. So they believe that the book would have been written between 65 and 70 AD. That original Hebrew text that we talk about is lost. They don't have the original Hebrew text. However, they've got a Greek copy from around about 100 to 200 AD. And this Greek copy was confirmed by historians at the time by the name of Irenaeus and Pentanus as accurate early church historians. Now, we've gone through lots of information this morning. We've breezed through it quickly. But as we read through Matthew, as I keep saying, it's important to know the background and the times that Matthew was writing into. We come to our last module this morning, module number 4, and this is the purpose, or the set out of the book. What was its purpose? Well, Matthew's writing, Matthew's writing is like a defense. It's an apologetic writing that's directed predominantly at the Jews of the time. And the reason that scholars believe this is because Matthew addresses issues that would have been difficult for a Jewish mind to comprehend. Gentiles wouldn't have cared one iota, but they would have been stumbling blocks for a Jewish reader. I'll give you some examples of what I mean. Matthew addresses the virgin birth out of wedlock. For a Jew, the birth of Jesus out of wedlock would have been a problem. He addresses the death on the cross, because the Jews believed, cursed is the man who dies on the tree. He deals with the Sabbath. Remember we talked about the Talmud and the scribes who had written about the Sabbath, but it wasn't scriptural. He deals with that. He deals with the bribing of the guards. He deals with the procedures of the Sanhedrin. He has a sense of history in his writing. See, Matthew starts out with the genealogy of Jesus. A Gentile wouldn't care one iota, doesn't care one bit. However, for a Jew, it's everything. What tribe does he come from? Who's his ma and pa? It's important to a Jew, the genealogy of Jesus. Matthew also deals with the fulfillment of prophecy. He deals with the fulfillment of prophecy in his book. And through this book we will read and we'll see it said. He finishes sentences by saying, as it is said or as it is written. The book of Matthew is a little bit like a Christianity for Dummies. Do you remember those books, Microsoft for Dummies? Well, this book is very well laid out. It's professionally written. It could be read by Jews and Gentiles alike. And the book of Matthew was a great tool for evangelism. And I would suggest to us today that Matthew's a great manual for young Christians. 3, the structure and the layout. Well, the book of Matthew is made up of 6 narratives and 5 discourses. In order. So narrative, discourse, narrative, discourse. It's very well organised in its structure. The narrative that he starts with is a description of events. We went there, we did this. A discourse is a discussion, a conversation, if you will, a dialogue. He said, she said. So we've gone through lots of information today. But it will start to make sense a little bit more as we navigate through Matthew. So if I could remind you this morning, for your homework for 2 weeks' time is to read Matthew 1 to 3 in your notebook, as we said. But please remember, next Sunday is Mother's Day, and we have a very special Sunday planned for Mother's Day. So next Sunday is Mother's Day, then 2 weeks we'll return to Matthew. Let's finish this morning in prayer, shall we? Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you in prayer this morning. Thank you so much that we can talk about Matthew this morning, the book of Matthew. And the reason that we were learning about Matthew is because you were so keen to have a relationship, so wanting to be in a relationship with us, that you sent your Son into this hodgepodge of the world at the time to die so that we can be in a relationship with you. And we thank you for that. We love you so much. We know that you love us. We're enjoying as we look through Matthew, and please help us to open up these scriptures so that we can be more in tune and learn more about you, and our relationship with you will be deeper as we learn about these things that happen. We pray all these things in your special name. Amen. Great. We'll see you next week for Mother's Day, and then 2 weeks' time for the continuation of Matthew, the Memoirs of a Tax Collector. Thank you, everyone.